Let's move to the next speaker, Goran Roos. Okay, one of the 13 most influential thinkers for the 21st century by the Spanish business journal Dirección y Progreso. Was appointed Manufacturing for the Future Thinker in Residence by the South Australian Premier for the year 2011, appointed member of the Prime Minister Manufacturing Leader Group 2012-2013, multiple assignment around the globe. So thank you to be here, and looking forward to listen your presentation. You have the time is here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much for being here. I will try to cover a couple of areas. I'll talk a little bit about history, because if we do not understand history, we are generally doomed to repeat its mistakes. I'll talk a little bit about industry policy and why it matters. And if you want to have two quick examples of why industry policy matters, you can do two comparisons. You can look at what remains of the engineering and manufacturing industry relating to oil and gas when you compare UK and Norway, and see why one has a lot and the other one has very little when it comes to global export and revenue from that side. You can compare why the largest mining nation in Europe, which is Germany, has very little export and around equipment and manufacturing compared to the second largest mining nation in Europe, which is Sweden, in those type of areas. So industry policy does matter in generating those type of influence. So we'll talk about what it is. So let's look at the history first. Historically, there are four ways of manufacturing. And when I say manufacturing, our biggest enemy, by the way, is statistics. You know, as George Bernard Shaw says, there is lies, damned lies, and statistics. All right? So when we talk about all these numbers, manufacturing going down, it's basically a statistical problem more than a real problem. Let me give you an example. A company that employs 50% of its employees in services and solutions, 25% in R&D, and 25% in manufacturing. Is that a service company or a manufacturing company? Right? And it generally statistically is treated as a service company. This happens to be Ericsson. Right? So it's definitely a manufacturing company, because not a single one of the services would be delivered unless the manufactured product was there. So don't get fooled by the statistics. When I say manufacturing, I mean the art and business of making things. And it doesn't matter whether they're digital or physical in that domain. Right, so the first wave was basically around trade-enabled barriers. We entered free trade agreements and stuff like that. Companies discovered that they could reach new customers. The customers got new benefits. The companies got economies of scale. Most of the large traditional manufacturing multinationals we have originated in that wave. That became the first opportunity for manufacturing growth. The second wave started when companies discovered that production cost was lower in one place than in another, and that allowed them to move complete activities to one other area. So they put the manufacturing plant somewhere where it was cheaper, and that basically generated the opportunity for offshoring as we know it today. The third wave started when ICT started to enable companies to split up their activities in very small component activities without incurring the associated coordination costs. And we could spread all these things out and still coordinate them. And that generally is what we call outsourcing and splitting up of the value chains in this area. Most industries will be in this wave today, specifically out of Europe. The fourth wave we've heard a little bit about. It has many different names. I happen to call it backshoring. And the reason for we seeing that is actually quite interesting. There are three primary reasons today. The first one is a structural reason, which actually is the smallest one in number of companies. The second one is dramatically reduced energy costs in the US, which has driven a lot of those things back. And the third one is that there is usually a lead time of 4 to 6 years between a company putting something out there and discovering it was a mistake and bringing it back again. That actually is the biggest component in Germany, for example. So why is the structural component there? Well, it's wage cost we heard, combined with escalating transportation costs, which reduced these outsourced savings. There is issues around delivery speed and closeness to market becoming significant drivers to success, as we have heard. There is quality issues around suppliers in outsourced location, which means people can't continue to operate there. There are intellectual property issues. There are life cycle shortening with the associated volume reduction that reduce economies of scale issues. There are benefits of co-locating design, development, and production. There is energy displacing labor as the cost of primary cost drivers, and there is co-location with key knowledge providers and markets. 66% of global manufacturing is today located in or close to its major market. So of course the reason you go to China today is not that it's cheaper, it's because it's your major market. So there are a number of issues around that. Then if we move forward, we can see that these issues, there we are, these issues are driven, these waves are driven by the relative rebalancing of 4 types of forces. There is the forces of technology development, and we've heard a number of those. They're about ICT, big data analytics and stuff like that, additive manufacturing, industrial biotechnology, primarily areas of microbial consortia engineering, which is dramatically changing some process issues. There is Internet of Things development, photonics, advanced materials, nanotechnology, robotics that we will hear more about tomorrow, I think, micro and nanotechnology, and changes in production systems around high-cost countries. So these technology development, and more than the one I've listed, will change things up and down, as illustrated by ICT. And one of the major changes we foresee over the coming 10-year period is the biotechnology one in this domain. Then we have the forces that either want to disperse or concentrate activities. They are things like wage cost drivers, operating environment for business with institutional settings areas, the changes in importance of economies of scale, there is average life cycle issues, and a number of those other areas. One of the key things there to keep in mind from a policy perspective is that a decision timeline for a company is 10 to 20 years, whereas the electoral cycle is quicker. And if the electoral cycle shows policies from left to right continuously, companies will avoid investing, because they require that certainty over long term. So the industry policy framework has to have some continuity in this area. And then, of course, we have continuously changing consumer and customer behaviors. What we want today is not what we wanted yesterday. And if we look at some numbers here, and just do some simple issues, we can look at cost competitiveness, and of course green is unchanged, and the redder it is, the worse it is. So we see that some countries, like for example Australia, has had a really bad period here in terms of increasing costs. And if we look at some of these studies that came out of the Boston Consulting Group at the bottom here, you can see that the relative manufacturing cost index is dramatic. I mean, Australia today is the highest cost country in the world to make things in, right? Substantially higher than anywhere else. That is not in itself a problem, and we have one of the best manufacturing nations in the world are just north of here, and it is the second highest cost country in the world to make things in, and they do very well. The problem for Australia, which is interesting from a policy perspective, is that the change in Australia from a very cheap place to a very expensive place has happened since 2008. In other words, an incredibly rapid shift. And that means we've had some really interesting policy learnings about what works and what does not work in this environment, because this will automatically knock out those companies which compete on cost. It's impossible to compete on cost if you operate in one of these places and if you don't have a scale-based market domestically. It just isn't possible. And Australia is the size of the US with 23 million people, which means that transportation costs are incredibly high and you've got a very small domestic market. So you're forced to think differently in how to do things. We've heard a lot about digitalization and the issues around that, and that links also to how this complexity of manufacturing system works. This picture you may have seen. So the value-adding potential in the production bit of manufacturing is continuously declining, whereas the value-adding potential in the pre- and post-production is continuously increasing. And this is, of course, driving what we see in companies, what we call servitization. Why manufacturing firms add services to their offerings, and why they then are forced to go digital to benefit from the opportunities that provide. And this, of course, means that if you sit smack bang in the middle and don't do anything beforehand and don't do anything at the end, in other words, you are a contract manufacturer, you are in trouble, because that means that you will be pressurized to the lowest cost location in the world very rapidly. And if we then add to that the issue that digitalization is rapidly coming in a number of domains, so it's increasing rapidly from today to tomorrow in the pre-production areas, rapidly in the post-production areas, and shrinking the physical space of the production activities, it is likely that we will see an outsourcing of that production bit to almost service providers to do that. And everything else is where the value will sit in these areas. Then it becomes an issue of how quickly that will happen and how complex your products are. You know, and sometimes we get this simplistically wrong. And let me give you an example. I was at a very large plant somewhere in Asia, doesn't matter. They make plastics, all right? And they make huge volumes of plastic. And in so doing, they have tools. You know, we all have tools, the piece of metal that comes together with the tool. And they had just invested a lot of money in, you know, digital manufacturing equipment, so 3D printers to make these tools. And it's interesting because obviously if you make these tools using traditional CNC technique, and standard tool costs you give or take $500. Whereas you make it in a 3D, you know, printer is $10,000 for the same tool, you know, give or take. So one would assume that that was a stupid decision, right? But the answer is it wasn't, because obviously the volume they had and the ability they could make these tools in ways you can't make otherwise. In this area, they could speed up the cooling down because of the heat dissipation structure of the tool, using manufacturing techniques that you can't do using it normally. Means that the payback time for this cost for one tool was counted in hours. Okay? It wasn't days, it was hours, right? In this sense. And then, of course, it's natural for them to move in this and put it in-house because the tool makers did not offer that service, right? The tool makers were stuck. So I went to one of these tool makers and I spoke to them. And I said, you know, talk generally, I said, you used to have this company over there as a customer. I say, yes. You don't have it as a customer now? No. Why not? We don't know. We think we became too expensive. Okay? So in other words, they had no idea what has happened. Don't fall in that trap to look solely at the cost. You have to look at the value for money that resides in new technologies. That's a key critical message. So, as we heard before, especially Kathy said that, you know, sometimes companies want to move back to another place, but it turns out they can't, because what's happened while they were gone was that the industrial complexity, the underlying industrial commons disappeared. You know, if I want to start a company out of a university, medical devices, whatever, I need to have access to somebody who can bend a bit of plastic, somebody can bend a bit of metal, somebody do a bit of electronics. And if they are no longer there, they're stuffed. Then they have to go somewhere where these things exist. And one of the problems we have is when we allow deindustrialization to take place for a period of time, then the industrial commons or the industrial economic complexity gets hollowed out and you cannot rebuild it. It is almost impossible to rebuild this once it is gone. And there is an economic complexity in the index, so you can look at those things and see where they are. And it's quite interesting that the top 4 countries you have listed there in economic complexity, which is why you tend to find that there are a huge amount of economic development, huge amount of startup issues in manufacturing activities in those countries, because they have access to all the necessary bits, which is why it's almost impossible to set up manufacturing in a place where there isn't anything unless you make enormous investments like Thailand has done in Rayon, and the payback time will be some time from a government point of view. So do keep in mind, economic complexity on a regional basis is fundamental, critical, and industrial policy must ensure that this economic complexity is maintained and developed. The other thing is that there is a conflict between national and regional areas around what type of industries you want. Because generally on the regional level, the regional government wants employment. National governments want long-term positive development. Employment is in medium-tech industries, long-term development is in high-tech industries. High-tech industries get almost no local employment, because they are part of global supply chains with very specialized equipment coming from all over the world, whereas medium tech has a good balance between local industry suppliers and global industry suppliers. And this is a balance that needs to be managed, and there will be conflict between regional and national governments in this area generally, and that must be taken up front and discussed. Now, what will happen as a consequence of these things? I have here a slide which tries to say some of these things. The first one we have heard already from the beginning today is the incredibly importance that manufacturing has in driving total factor productivity. It is the key driver of factor productivity in all activities, services, public sector, whatever you want. This will become even more pronounced as manufacturing digitalizes. And that means that economies that doesn't have this art of making things within their boundaries will slip behind in terms of productivity improvements. And that means that the national economy will not be able to support the same either increase or stability in living standard as has before. This is a major challenge. We also heard that it drives jobs in economic activities. Now this role, we tend to call it multiplier effect. This role will be reduced as digitalization happens because it moves into the service domain where the multiplier effect is substantially lower. And this puts a challenge on economies to find other places to generate jobs. That means you need more companies, more activities in this area, which means that entrepreneurial emphasis becomes really important in this area. Manufacturing jobs pays better. They will be more emphasized as a consequence of the level of sophistication. Manufacturing in today's world is basically a white-collar job, and it's becoming even more so. The blue-collar, the times when you had no education and went into manufacturing is gone, right? You will require highly educated people with deep skills that are continuously developed. And generally speaking, you will have to change your career paths in companies because of the technology development area. So instead of coming in, working in R&D and staying your life in R&D, you will likely have to work with a product generation and then move from that into its pre-production and then into its production and then into its service, where you can keep your knowledge relevant to that technology domain, because your ability to keep up once you have left university is almost impossible with new developed technologies. So we need new structures for career paths in companies, and we have a greater emphasis on lifelong learning. Tax revenue issue, as we see, manufacturing is critical. That will become smaller because of digitalization and fewer people, and the less multiplier effect. And the R&D effect, which will become even more pronounced. So there are numerous changes here which are quite critical in this area. So what should policy focus? Here are a set of areas which I'll not go through, but this is the drivers of productivity in a high-cost economy for a company. And these are the areas that you really need to ensure that they happen. And to give you the importance of it, if you increase managerial competence by a sixth, it is the equivalent of either increasing the available man-hours in the factory by 25% or by increasing the working capital by 65%. So management does matter. It matters a lot. And one of the things we struggle with at SMEs is low level of management, generally speaking. So management development is critical. And we have a number of areas here, which I'm not going to go through. Happy to take questions on them. If you look at the policy recommendations that you go out and discuss and observe on companies, there are a number of things here which are critical. And I would just say a few words on the last one there, which is the use of appropriate economic framework. And now, I'm an engineer, so I'm going to be brutal here. Economics is not a science, it's a point of view, okay? And there are many different points of views. And within that, we don't understand enough. We are not good at causalities. We don't understand, we can't predict effects very well on this area. Now, there are different points of views, and in general policy areas, there are about 4 or 5 that matters. You know, it's neoclassical economics, neo-Keynesian, neo-Schumpeterian, institutional, evolutionary, those type of issues. And what differs from them is the assumptions they make. And none of them are right or wrong, they just are, okay? So the key issue is when you develop a policy, ensure that that is grounded in an economic framework, because that gives you the tools, which is based on assumptions that are fulfilled in your scenario. For example, the neoclassical economic assumes that all innovation happens outside the economy. Nothing happens inside the economy. And all that happens is available at the same marginal cost with the same marginal return to everybody in the economy, okay? That's fine if you're Vietnam. It's not so good if you're Switzerland, right? So you have to be very careful of looking at these things, so you don't just jump into a toolbox without understanding what it will do for you. And generally speaking, what you have to look at is more demand-side tools in countries that are high cost. In other words, you have to use that smart procurement, you have to use the regulation that drives things, and you have to look at that type of an area. So my key message is policy matters. You have to ensure that when you develop policy, you address the key things that are basis for drivers in both firms and economy in a high-cost environment, and that they are based on an economic framework that is relevant for the setting that you have. Thank you.